Tonight, we're standing in a wide, flat field in southern Illinois, just across the river from St. Louis, looking up at a hill that should not be here. It's about 10 stories tall. Its sides are grass. Its top is flat. And every basket of earth inside it was carried to this spot by hand, by people born about 1,000 years ago. This is the largest thing ever built out of earth in the ancient Americas. And around it, once, stood a city. The biggest city anywhere north of Mexico, for centuries. Tens of thousands of people lived here. They farmed corn, they fished the river, they played games in a plaza the size of dozens of football fields, and they raised more than 100 earthen hills out of this floodplain. And then, over a couple of slow generations, they left. The houses came down. The plaza went to grass. And by the time the first European maps of this valley were drawn, the people who could have explained the place were long gone. And the rest of the world decided, wrongly, that it was a mystery who had built this place at all. So here are the questions we're going to lie here and turn over tonight. How does a city this big appear, almost all at once, on an empty stretch of river? What was it actually like to live an ordinary afternoon inside it? Why, in the end, did everyone decide to walk away? And why did later arrivals find it easier to invent a story around it rather than admit who really built these mounds? We'll get to all of it soon. Although you've probably never heard of it, this place has been here for 800 years. So there's no rush tonight, and it can certainly wait for us to get comfortable. But before we set out, if these slow journeys through history help carry you off to sleep, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel, and we will be here to do this for you again, every single night. And if a place comes to mind as we go, somewhere you'd like us to wander to next, leave it down in the comments. We read them. Some of them likely become episodes. Now, dim the lights, if they aren't already. Pull the blanket up, tuck your feet in, and put yourself there, on the floodplain in the late day. Flat grass underfoot, a lazy brown river off to your right, wood smoke somewhere on the air, and a green mountain in front of you that many pairs of hands carried here, one load at a time. Let's start with the size, because the size of this place is the first thing that's hard to believe. At its peak, around the year 1100, this city covered something like 4,000 acres. Estimates of how many people lived here vary, but the usual range is between 10 and 20,000. That may not sound enormous by modern numbers, but for North America, at that moment in history, it was. As far as we can tell, it was larger than London was at the same time. A person who lived here was living in the largest community for hundreds and hundreds of miles in any direction they could have walked. And it wasn't only what's protected today. The site you can visit is the central core. The full ancient landscape, what archaeologists now call Greater Cahokia, sprawled much wider, with more mound groups spreading out across the river bottoms, in places that are now St. Louis and East St. Louis, and other towns nearby. Many of those outer mounds were flattened over the last 2 centuries to build the modern cities, before anyone thought to protect them. So when we talk about Cahokia, picture something bigger than the park. Picture a whole inhabited region with this one place as its capital. In In that core, there were about 120 mounds. Some were flat platforms with buildings on top. Some were low ridges. Some were rounded. And one, the grass mountain we're standing under, was the giant. Today it's called Monk's Mound, after some French monks who lived nearby many centuries later and had nothing whatsoever to do with building it. It rises about 30 meters. It climbs in 4 broad terraces, like enormous steps. And on the very top, once, stood a large building, looking out over everything. Here's the thing to hold on to, because it gets pictured wrong constantly. This is not a stone pyramid. There is no cut stone here at all. It is packed earth, clay and soil and grass, shaped into a flat-topped mountain and held in place essentially by being very carefully piled and maintained. People sometimes imagine something Egyptian or something Maya, all dressed stone and sharp, clean edges. It was none of that. It was earth, which, if anything, makes it harder, not easier, because a 30-meter heap of soil does not want to stay standing. Keeping it up there was its own slow kind of engineering. We don't know what these people called this place. We don't know what they called themselves. The name Cahokia comes from a different group who lived in the area much later, long after the great city was already gone. And we've simply borrowed it because we have nothing else to call it. So everything we say tonight, we say about a city whose real name was one of the things it took with it. Now, cities usually grow slowly. A village gets a little bigger. A market does well. A road brings traffic. Over a couple of centuries, you've now got a town, and maybe, eventually, something more. Cahokia was different. For a long time, the people of this floodplain lived much the way the wider region did, in scattered villages, farming a little, fishing, getting by. Corn had become a serious crop here by around the year 900. People were settled. Life was, as far as we can tell, fairly ordinary and had been for generations. And then, around the year 1050, something changed, and it changed fast. Archaeologists actually have a nickname for it. They call it Cahokia's Big Bang. In the space of a generation or so, not centuries, a generation, the population jumped, mounds went up, the ground was leveled and planned out into plazas, and the whole place became a kind of capital, pulling people and goods and influence in from a very long way off. 1 decade, scattered villages. Practically the next, by the standards of how slowly history usually moves, a planned city. We don't know exactly why. That's worth saying plainly and early, because it's one of the real mysteries of this place, and we'll keep bumping into it. Something drew people here, in large numbers, quickly. Maybe it was a new idea, a way of organizing life, a set of beliefs, a leader or a family of leaders with a vision and the pull to make it happen. Maybe it was the land itself, this rich bottomland where corn grew well and great rivers met and trade could move in every direction. Maybe it was a single event we'll never have a record of, the way you can't reconstruct a rumor 1,000 years after it spread. What we can see is the result. People came, and they came on purpose, and they built. And once they were here, they did something that's genuinely hard to take in, which is the next thing we'll look at. With no machines, no wheels, and no animals to help them carry anything, they decided to move a mountain's worth of earth. And they decided to do it one basket at a time. To build Monk's Mound, people dug earth out of the ground in one place, leaving borrow pits that, in some cases, we can still find today. And they carried it to another place, and they set it down, and they packed it, and then they walked back and did it again. They didn't have wheelbarrows. They didn't have carts because they had no draft animals, no oxen, no horses. None of that existed in the Americas yet. They didn't have metal tools of any kind. What they had was woven baskets, digging sticks, and their own backs. A full basket of damp earth weighs a great deal. The Great Mound contains, by the usual estimate, something like 14 million of them. So picture the work, not as one heroic image, but as a thing that happened every day, for years, and then for more years. A line of people walking from a borrow pit to the growing mound, loaded baskets riding on their shoulders, setting the earth down, walking back empty, filling up again. Children, very likely, carrying smaller loads alongside the adults. The whole community, in shifts, across seasons, across the better part of a lifetime for the largest mounds. The hill we're standing under is not, as far as we can tell, a monument to one ruler's vanity. It's a monument to an astonishing amount of ordinary, patient, shared effort. At the foot of the Great Mound lay the Grand Plaza, a wide, open, deliberately flattened public space, large enough to gather a great part of the city at once. And it really was deliberate. The ground there was engineered, the low spots filled in and the high spots cut down to make one level field for whatever the city did together. The mounds and the plaza weren't scattered at random either. They were laid out with care, lined up with the directions, set around that open center. People planned that layout. And then thousands of them spent their lives making the plan real. That is the real measure of Monk's Mound. Not one ruler's monument, as far as we can tell, but the work of thousands of ordinary people. 14 million baskets of earth carried by hand across whole lifetimes to make a place where everyone could stand together. They left no names behind. They left the mountain. Let's come down off the mound now and walk through the city the way it actually was on an ordinary afternoon. The first thing to fix in your mind is what the houses looked like. These were not teepees. Teepees belonged to other groups of people in other places and later times out on the plains. There were none here. These were not log cabins, and they were not stone. The houses of Cahokia were built by digging narrow trenches, standing wooden posts upright in them, and filling the walls between with woven mats and bundled grass under a steep roof of thatch. Snug, rectangular, partly sunk into the ground for warmth, set close together in neighborhoods. From cooking fires, smoke would have risen all across the city, a low haze of it hanging over the rooftops in the morning. People here farmed the rich floodplain. Corn, above all, fields of it spreading out from the edges of the city. Squash, seeds and greens of several kinds. They fished the river and the quiet backwater lakes, set baskets and nets, took ducks and geese off the water, hunted deer in the woods, and gathered nuts in the fall. The people here were not hungry most of the time. It was a place that grew enough surplus to feed thousands of people who weren't farming at all, because those people were doing something else. Cahokia had many specialists, people who worked shell, grinding and drilling small beads out of seashells that had traveled hundreds of miles up from the Gulf Coast. People who worked copper, hammered thin and bright, brought down from the Great Lakes. People who made pottery, including a particular dark, sharp-shouldered, finely marked style we now call Rami incised. The good pottery, the kind with meaning worked right into the surface of it. Mica from the southern mountains, polished stone, fine tools. Goods came into this city from clear across the middle of the continent, and goods and ideas went back out the same way. So stand in a neighborhood lane in the late afternoon and just be here a moment. Thatch roofs close on either side, packed earth underfoot, the smell of wood smoke and cooking corn, a dog barking somewhere, the river off past the fields, and the green wall of the great mound rising over the rooftops at the center of everything, so large you stop noticing it, the way you stop noticing a mountain you grew up beneath. This was a city, not a mystery yet, not a ruin, not a riddle, just a city, full of people who knew exactly what their jobs were and what they were having for supper. Now let's go back out to that Grand Plaza, because it was not empty ground. It was where the whole city came together. One of the things they did there was play a game called Chunkey. We know it from all across the Mississippian world, and Cahokia, by every sign, was obsessed with it. The basic idea is simple. One player rolls a smooth, polished stone disc across the flat ground, and the others hurl long spears after it, each trying to land their throw where the rolling stone is going to stop. It's a game of judgment and timing and nerve, and people watched it and bet on it and traveled to see it. So picture a crowd ringed around the edge of that huge flat field on a clear day, all of them following the roll of a single stone. Some things really don't change in 1,000 years. We still gather at the edge of fields, in our own century, and care just as much about where a small ball comes to rest, just like the people of Cahokia did. They also watched the sky, closely and with purpose. Off to one side of the city stood a great ring of tall red cedar posts, set upright in the ground in a circle. We call it Woodhenge. It was not there for decoration. Stand at the center post on the right morning of the year, and the sun comes up exactly in line with one of the ring posts, marking the solstices, the equinoxes, the turning points of the seasons, a calendar that farming people lives and plans by. And it wasn't only the henge. The whole city was laid out with attention to the four directions and to the sky, the plaza, the mounds, the alignments, all of it arranged by people paying close, practical attention to where the sun stood and what time of year it was. None of this was guesswork. It was astronomy, done by hand. People watching the sky year after year, keeping an accurate calendar with cedar posts and patience, and getting it right because they needed to know exactly when to plant their crops. Now let's move on to one of the mounds in particular, known today simply as Mound 72. This mound, when excavated, turned out to be a burial site. A great many of them. Some were people laid to rest with enormous ceremony and wealth. The most famous is what's called the beaded burial, where individuals were placed on a blanket of tens of thousands of shell beads with other rich goods arranged around them. For a long time, the central figure was described as a male ruler tied to a falcon or birdman image known across the Mississippian world. More recent and careful study has complicated that neat picture. It now appears that at least one of the principal individuals was a woman. The honest position today is a modest one. It was the burial ground of clearly important people, with bird imagery somewhere in the meaning of it. And we can't claim much more than that, because we don't know much more than that. And then there are the other burials in that same mound. Groups of people, including a number of young women, buried together at one time in a way most archaeologists read as deliberate. It is thought that these were sacrifices, tied to ceremony and to the power of whoever was being honored there. It was a very sobering discovery. Cahokia had power. It had hierarchy. It had ceremony with a real and terrible human cost. It was a great city. And great cities, all through human history, have asked unbearable things of some of the people inside them. We don't know their names. We don't know what they believed was happening to them or whether they had any say in it at all. The only thing we have to give them across all that distance is to look and to not look away and to not pretend it was anything smaller or stranger than it was. And now we will let them rest and walk back out into the ordinary city around them. For a couple of centuries, Cahokia was the great city of its world. And then, slowly, things began to change. And the clearest single sign of that change is a wall. At some point, the people of Cahokia built a palisade, a tall wooden stockade, thousands of logs set upright in the earth, around the central precinct, the heart of the city, with the great mound and the plaza. And they didn't build it just once. They rebuilt it more than once, over time, which means it mattered enough to have to keep rebuilding it. Now, a wall can mean a lot of things. A wall can mean defense, that someone, at some point, was afraid of an attack. It can mean a boundary, a line drawn between the sacred center and the ordinary city, or between the powerful few and everyone else. It can mean a change in who was in charge and how they wanted to be seen. We can see the wall. We can date it, roughly. What we cannot do is read the minds of the people who chose to build it. Anyone who tells you flatly that Cahokia fell to a war is telling you considerably more than the evidence actually knows. And around the same time, other things were changing too. People started making their pottery and their tools in new ways. Houses were built in different shapes and sizes than before. And the long-distance trade, shell carried up from the Gulf Coast, copper brought down from the Great Lakes, began to dry up. No single one of these is a disaster. But put them all together, and they look like a whole society changing the way it did nearly everything, and no one left us a record of why. Something was changing at Cahokia. The people living through it knew exactly what it was. Us, though, we only see the wall, the broken patterns, and the unanswered questions. Which brings us, at last, to the big one. The question everyone really wants answered. Why did it end? Here's the honest answer, up front, before we go through the suspects one by one. Unfortunately, the answer is that nobody knows. There is no single proven cause for the end of Cahokia. What there is instead is a stack of reasonable explanations, each with some real evidence behind it, none of them strong enough to win on its own. So let's lay them out and weigh them like the open questions they are. The first suspect is the river. Cahokia rose and flourished during a long stretch when the Mississippi was relatively calm and there was not much serious flooding. Then, around the year 1200, right about when the decline begins, the sediment record shows a major flood. And for a city built on a floodplain, depending on floodplain fields, a great flood, or a return to regular flooding after generations of quiet, could ruin standing crops and stored food, and the basic confidence that this was a safe place to keep living. It's a real clue. It is not, by itself, a verdict. The second suspect is drought. Other research, reading the old climate out of the mud at the bottom of nearby lakes, points to a drying trend. Less summer rain across the same period the population was falling. Less rain means less corn, and a city of 20,000 people runs on corn. Again, a real pressure, a real clue, but again, not proof of a single clean cause. You'll notice that those first two suspects, flood and drought, sound like opposites. Too much water, and then not enough. That isn't a mistake or a contradiction. The climate record doesn't arrive in tidy, single stories, and a city can be squeezed from more than one direction across a couple of hard generations. The third suspect is the people themselves. Politics, in the broad sense. Think back to that wall and to the changing crafts and houses we just talked about. Those are the signs of a community under some kind of internal strain. Maybe what undid Cahokia wasn't a flood or a drought at all, but something between people. A loss of trust, a struggle over power, a falling out we'll never have the details of. Because a city is, when you get down to it, an agreement. It holds together for exactly as long as enough people keep choosing to stay and keep choosing to do their part to run it. And people can also, over time, simply stop agreeing. There's a fourth idea you may well have heard, and it's worth correcting, because for years it got told as plain fact. The story went like this. The Cahokians cut down too many trees for firewood and for those thousands of heavy palisade logs, and so they wrecked their own land, brought on erosion and worse flooding, and doomed themselves. It's a tidy little morality tale, and it has a clear villain, which is part of why people liked it. But more recent work actually went looking for the physical evidence of that self-inflicted collapse and found very little of it. So we should hold that one loosely or set it down altogether. The land does not appear to have punished Cahokia for cutting wood. And a fifth, which we mention only to cover all of our bases, is disease. It's possible that illness played some part. But for Cahokia, in these particular centuries, that's a guess without solid evidence behind it, and we'll treat it honestly as a guess and move along. So, flood, drought, the slow failure of a great shared agreement, resource strain, probably overstated, and maybe other things we'll never get to name. The truth is almost certainly not any one of these alone. It's several of them, braided together across decades. which is a good deal less satisfying than a single villain, and a good deal more like the way real things usually end. However it happened, it did not happen all at once. There was no final day, no sudden fire we can point to, no army at the gate, no last person closing the last door behind them. And that's the part our imaginations tend to resist, because we like our endings to have a clear moment in them. Cahokia didn't end in a moment. It ended in a long, slow letting go. Over decades, families left. Some moved to other towns. Some joined or helped found communities elsewhere. Some simply went where life looked better. And as people left, the city did less of everything. Fewer hands meant fewer mounds kept up, fewer crafts worked, fewer great gatherings out on the plaza. A neighborhood empties one household at a time. The fields at the edges go unworked and quietly starts becoming overgrown. And a place that only works with a critical mass of people, once it slips below a certain number, simply stops being a city. It becomes a smaller thing, and then a thinner thing, and then, finally, a place where people used to live. By somewhere around the year 1400, the great urban center of Cahokia stood effectively empty. The mounds still stood. The plaza still stood. The river still moved past it all. But the city, once a vast, living city full of life, was finished. The word we use for this matters, because the wrong word has done real and lasting damage. The people did not vanish. They were not lifted off the face of the earth. They did not die to the last child in some single catastrophe. They left. They went elsewhere, and they kept living, as families, as communities, as part of the long and continuing story of native people across this part of the world. Abandoned is fair. Dispersed is fair. Vanished is not. And we're about to see just how much trouble that one wrong word would go on to cause. Centuries later, new people came up the Mississippi Valley. European settlers pushing west, and they found the mounds. Hundreds of them, scattered across the eastern half of the continent, and here at Cahokia, the greatest of them all. This enormous earthen mountain, standing alone in the grass. And a great many of those newcomers looked at these mounds and decided, comfortably, that the Native Americans they were busy pushing off the land could not possibly have built such things. So they made up a story instead. They imagined a vanished race of mound builders, some lost, conveniently non-native people who supposedly came and built all this and then disappeared before the current inhabitants arrived. Refugees from the old world, a lost tribe of Israelites, wandering Vikings, people from Atlantis, anyone at all, really, so long as it wasn't the people actually living right there. And notice how very useful that story was. If a mysterious lost race built the mounds and then disappeared, then the land was, in a way, already emptied once, already taken from someone before. And taking it yet again was simply the way of the world. A fairy tale about the dead did real work for the living. None of it was true. And in the end, it was slow, careful archaeology that proved as much. In particular, the work of a man named Cyrus Thomas, working for the Bureau of American Ethnology in the late 1800s. He set out, with government backing, to settle the mound builder question once and for all. And with the evidence laid out in front of him, he concluded plainly what never should have been in doubt at all. The mounds of North America were built by the ancestors of Native Americans, by the people who were already here. Cahokia is a Native American city, a Mississippian city, built by the forebears of people who were standing right there the entire time, being told that their own grandfather's work must have belonged to somebody else. That's the second mystery of Cahokia, and in some ways it's the uglier one. The first mystery, why the city ended, is the honest kind, the kind made of missing evidence and an incomplete record. This second mystery was manufactured on purpose by people who found the plain truth inconvenient. The one piece of good news in it is that the truth, in the end, turned out to be far more durable than the lie. So let's end where we began, standing in the grass beneath the great mound. Cahokia was not cursed. It was not a riddle left behind by aliens, and it was not a warning aimed at us. It was a city, a real, ambitious, complicated, deeply human city that rose quickly and lived for a few hundred years. It watched the sky and kept its calendar. It played its games out on the plaza. It fed its thousands. It asked a great deal of the people in it, and some of that was beautiful and some of it was terrible. And then, for reasons we can only partly name, it was slowly let go. People raised it with their hands and their backs and their whole lifetimes. And when staying no longer made sense, those people left and carried their lives and their families and their stories away with them. The descendants of the Mississippian world did not disappear. Native nations connected to these places and these traditions are here today, across many states, living people with a living history, not a footnote and not a ghost. And the place itself is still here. You can go and visit it today, actually. The Great Mound still stands in southern Illinois, its terraces grown over with grass, and you can walk the long climb to the top and look out across the river at the towers of modern St. Louis. The Grand Plaza is open ground. Woodhenge has been marked out again in cedar posts, and the Mississippi still moves past all of it, the way it moved when 20,000 people lived along this bank, wide and brown and slow, exactly as it was. A city was raised here and lived in and finally let go. That is not a sad story. It's a true one, and a far more interesting one than the fairy tale that people once tried to put in its place. That's where we'll leave it tonight. A green mountain standing in the dark, a slow river going by, and a great city whose real name went home with its people. The lights are already low. Your blanket is already up. Your feet are already tucked in. There's nothing left to do now but let the river keep moving and let yourself drift off somewhere along with it. Sleep well, and we'll be right here again tomorrow night. And let's go back, past every kingdom and every empire, past the pyramids, past the very first farm that was ever planted, to a bare ridge of pale stone 11,500 years ago. where a few hundred people are about to do something nobody on Earth has ever done before. The hill has a name. In the local language, it's Göbekli Tepe, which means, more or less, Potbelly Hill, named for its round, swollen shape, the way it bulges up out of the flat plain like a full stomach after a very large meal. For most of recorded history, that was the single most interesting fact about it, a funny-shaped hill with a funny-sounding name. In 1963, a survey team from 2 universities walked across the top of it. They saw some broken slabs of limestone poking up out of the dirt and a scatter of old flint lying around, and they made a note that there was probably an old graveyard up here, nothing that couldn't wait. Then they moved on, and you cannot really blame them. A graveyard is a perfectly reasonable thing to find on a hill. It is the kind of answer that lets everyone pack up and go home for dinner. So the most important archaeological site on the planet sat there for another 30 years, filed away under "had a look, nothing special." Then, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt came to give it that second look. He had read the old survey notes, and where everyone before him had seen the tops of broken gravestones, something about the shape of those slabs would not leave him alone. So he climbed the hill. He looked at the stone, and he understood, more or less on the spot, that these were not gravestones at all. They were the very tops of enormous carved pillars, and the rest of each one was still down there, standing upright, buried up to the shoulders in the body of the hill. He is supposed to have said that he had 2 choices that day. He could turn around, walk back down, and say nothing to anyone. Or he could spend the rest of his life digging. He chose the digging. He ran the excavation for the next 20 years, and he never really stopped. When the first dates came back from the laboratory, they did the thing that good archaeology occasionally does, which is ruin everyone's afternoon. The stones were old. Not cathedral old. Not pyramid old. The oldest rings at Göbekli Tepe were raised around 9,500 years before the Common Era. Call it 11,500 years ago, give or take. Let me put that number somewhere you can actually feel it. Stonehenge, which most of us file under almost impossibly ancient, is about 5,000 years old. The Great Pyramid is about 4,500. Göbekli Tepe is roughly twice the age of either one. Put it this way. When the pyramids were going up, Göbekli Tepe had already been built, used, and buried for longer than the time that now separates us from those same pyramids. To the pharaohs, this place would already have been an ancient, half-forgotten thing, if they'd known about it at all. And here is the piece that rearranged the textbooks. For a very long time, the story of how civilization began went in a tidy order. First, people learned to farm. Farming gave them more food than they needed on the day. The spare food gave them spare time, and crowds, and villages. And only then, once they were settled and comfortable and sure of their next meal, did they get around to the grand, useless, beautiful things. The temples, the monuments, the carved art, the enormous symbolic projects you only attempt once your stomach is already full. Farming first, cathedrals later. That was the order, and for about 100 years more or less everyone agreed on it. Göbekli Tepe was built by people who had not invented farming yet. The monuments came first, and that single fact landed on the study of human history like a dropped plate. It sent archaeologists back to arguments they thought were settled, and it left a great many careful, credentialed people exactly where it leaves you right now, sitting up a little in the dark, asking how on earth that is possible. So who were they? The honest first answer sounds boring and turns out not to be boring at all. They were hunter-gatherers, not cavemen in the cartoon sense. No clubs, no dragging anyone around by the hair, none of that. These were people standing at the very end of the long age of hunting and gathering, right in the doorway of the settled farming world that was about to begin. They knew their land the way you know your own street. They knew where the wild gazelle moved with the seasons, and the wild boar, and the great herds of wild sheep. They knew which grasses came up heavy with grain you could grind into flour, and exactly when to go and cut them. They made fine, sharp tools out of flint and harder stone. They had fire and rope and baskets and dogs. The dog was the one animal that had thrown in with us by then, the first of all our animal partnerships, already curled up by the fire 11,500 years ago. And they had hands like yours, a back that got tired like yours, a head full of names and grudges and jokes that we are never, ever going to hear. That is worth holding on to as we go up the hill with them, because it is easy to talk about a place this old as if it were built by some different species. It wasn't. It was built by people, the same model of person you are, who would look at you lying there, warm under a blanket at the end of a long day and recognize you on sight. Now, what did they actually build? Picture a ring, a great oval room, 10, 15, 20 meters across, its wall made of rough stone and packed earth. Set into that wall, evenly spaced, standing upright all the way around, a series of carved pillars. And then, in the open center of the ring, 2 more pillars, taller than all the rest, standing on their own and facing each other across the empty middle. These are the famous stones, and they are shaped like a capital letter T, a tall, upright shaft with a broad slab laid across the top, like enormous stone tuning forks, or the world's heaviest doorways with no walls attached. The biggest of them stand well over 5 meters tall. That is taller than 3 people standing on each other's shoulders, cut from a single block of limestone, weighing many tons, hauled upright by hand. Archaeologists have given the best explored ring a plain name, Enclosure D, and it is the one that tends to stop people in their tracks. Because look closely at those 2 tall pillars in the center, and they are not just slabs. Down the sides there are arms, a pair of arms carved in low relief, bent at the elbow. Follow them around to the front, and the arms end in hands, long, careful fingers brought together over the place where a stomach would be, very nearly touching. There's a belt carved around the waist, and hanging from the belt, a kind of loincloth. These pillars are people, not portraits. The tops are blank. There are no faces, but bodies. Enormous, faceless, standing stone people, arranged in a ring, with 2 of them in the very heart of it, forever facing each other, hands almost meeting in the middle. Whoever they were meant to be, ancestors, guardians, gods, the honored dead, someone we have no word for at all. They have been standing in that exact pose, one carved hand reaching toward another carved hand, since before any human being had planted a field. Which brings us to the question you've probably been holding since the start. How? How did people with no metal at all make these? The pillars were quarried out of the limestone shelf that the hill itself sits on. To shape them, people took stone tools, flint and harder rock, and they pounded and scraped and pecked away at the limestone, hour after hour, day after day after day, turning a buried ridge of rock into a standing figure taller than a house. No iron chisels, no steel, no power of any kind except muscle and patience. And then they moved the finished pillars, each one weighing in the tons, with rope and baskets and wooden levers and ramps of piled earth, and a very large number of human shoulders, all pulling in the same direction at the same moment, because there were no draft animals broken to the harness yet, and no wheel to put a cart on even if they'd had one. And that very large number of people is the honest puzzle, the one that has never really gone away. A job like this needs hundreds of workers, fed and organized and pulling together for a long time. But the usual picture of this period is of small, scattered bands of hunters who followed the herds and kept moving. So where did the crowd come from? Who fed all those people while they hauled rock instead of hunting dinner? Who decided where each fox and each snake would go and made sure everyone stuck to the plan? We genuinely do not know. That is the silence at the center of this whole place. It is a big, strange, human-shaped silence, and once people started noticing it, it did not stay politely inside the universities. It got out into the wide world. And when a mystery this big gets out, people come to it carrying answers, some careful, some wild, all of them trying to fill the very same gap. We're going to walk through every one of them tonight. But first, two things that might explain how all those people got fed: the animals on the walls and the feast. Start with the animals, because the pillars are covered in them. Carved creatures everywhere, in low relief across the stone. Foxes, a lot of foxes, lean and baring their teeth. Wild boar, tusks out, bristles up the spine. Snakes, sometimes dozens of them at once, pouring down a single pillar like water down a window. Scorpions, tall, long-legged birds, cranes and the like. Wild cattle, the great aurochs with the long, curved horns. And vultures, big, heavy, unmistakable vultures, wings spread wide. This was not a friendly mural of farm animals, because there were no farm animals yet. This is the real bestiary of their actual world, the things that could bite you, gore you, sting you, poison you, or turn up to eat you once something else had finished the job. And these people took the most dangerous, most frightening parts of their world, and they carved them by hand onto the walls of the most important building they had, one careful tap of a flint pick at a time. Fear turned into art with enormous patience by someone who had every reason to be afraid. One stone in particular has become famous enough to earn its own nickname. It's called Pillar 43, and people know it as the Vulture Stone. On it, there's a large vulture with one wing crooked outward, oddly, almost like an arm held up. Around it and above it, there's a scatter of other figures, more birds, a scorpion, and, set right by the vulture's bent wing, a single round disc. Hold on to that circle, because we are going to come back to it later tonight. Some people believe it is the single most important circle ever carved by a human being. But here is the honest, slightly maddening truth about all of it. We do not know what any of it means. Not really. We don't know whether the foxes were dangerous spirits or friendly ones, whether the snake's art stood for death or water or family, whether the vulture stone is a story, a calendar, a gravestone, or a doodle that happened to get famous. The people who could have told us have been gone for 11,500 years, and they left their pictures without a single word of caption. It is the strangest kind of intimacy, a whole language of images made by hands like ours, sitting right there in front of us, close enough to touch, too old to read. So what was this place? When the world first heard about Göbekli Tepe, it arrived with a headline already attached, and the headline was 3 words long: World's First Temple. And you can see exactly why it stuck. Giant stone figures, standing in rings, covered in sacred-looking animals, built by people who hadn't even settled down yet. Of course, it's a temple, the oldest holy place on earth. It is a wonderful, clean, magazine cover idea. But the people who actually dig there have spent the years since carefully taking that headline apart, because the longer they dig, the more ordinary life they keep finding mixed in among the giant stones. Hearths where cooking fires burned, old rubbish heaps, which are the single most reliable sign that human beings were living somewhere, for the simple reason that human beings produce garbage. Grinding stones by the thousand for crushing wild grain into meal. Heaps of flint debris, the leftovers of people sitting and making tools. Channels cut into the rock to catch and hold rainwater. This is not an empty temple that wandering nomads visited once a year and left spotless. People worked here and lived here, or right up against here. And that points at the warmest answer of the 3, the one I keep coming back to. Look at all that food being processed. Grinding stones everywhere, big stone troughs and vessels, mountains of animal bone, the remains of wild grain handled at a scale far past what a single family eats for dinner. A lot of researchers now think a big part of what drew those scattered people to the hill over and over, year after year, was a feast, a gathering. You come in from the herds and the wild fields, you meet the other bands you only see a few times a year. You eat together until you can't move, and while everyone is here and fed and in a good mood, you all put your backs into the next stretch of wall, the next pillar. That is one very human answer to who fed the crowd. They fed each other. The building and the feasting and the coming together were all the same act. So the careful archaeologists have traded the word temple for a more careful one. They call the big rings communal, gathering places, special buildings, yes, but built by and for a scattered people who came together here and, for a while, felt like one people, which is, if anything, a warmer idea than a temple. Not priests and a god so much as a crowd, and a fire, and a feast, and the most ambitious building project any of them had ever seen. going up a little more each time they met. And here the story splits. Because a place this old, this strange, this seemingly impossible does not just sit on its hill being mysterious. People build theories on top of it, the way those first people built rings of stone. And over the last 30 years, 4 big ones have gone up. Some come from the careful folk with the trowels and the brushes. Some come from very late-night television. We are going to walk through all 4, give each one its best possible day in court, and then tell you, honestly, where the evidence really stands. Get comfortable. This is the part everybody argues about. The first theory comes from Klaus Schmidt himself, the archaeologist who spent the better part of 20 years digging the place up. So of the 4, it walks in with the best credentials. He argued it in his own books and papers, and it became the headline that carried Göbekli Tepe around the world. He liked to put it in 5 words. First came the temple, then the city. Here is what he meant, laid out properly. Everyone had always assumed farming came first, and the grand building came much later, once people were settled and fed and sure of the next meal. But the rings on this hill went up before farming, so Schmidt turned the question around. Instead of asking what these people could afford to build, he asked what the building itself might have done to them. And he proposed a mechanism, a chain of cause and effect that runs like this. Raising these rings took hundreds of people, gathered in one place, fed for weeks or months at a stretch, coming back season after season for generations. You cannot feed a standing crowd like that by hunting alone, because the herds keep moving and the wild harvest is scattered and brief. But the hills around Göbekli Tepe happened to be thick with the wild ancestors of wheat and barley, growing in dense natural stands. If you needed to keep the same crowd fed in the same spot, year on year, the natural thing to do is to start managing those wild grasses, protecting a patch, clearing it, scattering seed where you want it, coming back to harvest on purpose. Do that for enough generations, without anyone ever sitting down and deciding to invent agriculture. And you have invented agriculture. And this corner of the world is, in fact, one of the places where farming really did first take hold. So in Schmidt's telling, the gathering came first, and farming grew up around it as the way to keep the gathering fed. The temple did not wait for the harvest. The harvest was invented to serve the temple. It is a genuinely beautiful idea, and you can feel why it electrified people when he first said it out loud, that the very first thing our species settled down for was not bread, but meaning, and the bread came along afterward to keep the meaning fed. So where does that idea stand today? Softer than it did when Schmidt first lit it up. The same years of digging that turned up all those hearths and grinding stones and rubbish heaps also complicated his clean, dramatic story. The more they find, the less it looks like a lonely temple raised by pure wandering nomads who happened to invent farming on the side, and the more it looks like a place where people were already part settled, already halfway into the new world, gathering and feasting and building and edging toward farming all at the same time. So religion-built civilization has cooled into something more tangled and more honest. That worship and settling down and farming all came up together, braided over centuries, and we are still working out which strand pulled which. Less of a thunderclap. And to a lot of people, including me, more interesting, because it means nobody planned it. It just grew. The second theory is the one that put Göbekli Tepe on 100 magazine covers and a great deal of television. And it starts with that round disc we set aside, the one carved beside the vulture's wing on Pillar 43. It comes from two researchers at the University of Edinburgh, an engineer named Sweatman and his colleague Cyrus, who published a paper arguing that the vulture stone is not decoration at all. It is, they say, a message, a date written in animals. Here is how their reading works. They treat the carved creatures on Pillar 43 as symbols for groups of stars, the way we draw a scorpion for the constellation Scorpius or a bull for Taurus. Read that way, they argue. The particular arrangement of animals on the stone matches the night sky as it would have looked at one specific moment, a moment they calculate, from the slow wobble of the stars across the ages at around 11,000 years before the Common Era. And that date, they point out, lands right on top of something real. Around then, the Earth was passing through the torrid meteor stream, a wide band of comet debris. Our planet still crosses twice a year. And around then, the climate took a sudden, savage turn back toward the cold, the long freeze the scientists call the Younger Dryas. So Sweatman and his colleague proposed that the vulture stone records a comet strike, a swarm of fragments coming down out of the torrids, remembered and carved by the survivors as both a date and a warning. The round disc beside the vulture, in their reading, is the comet itself. And you can feel why it caught fire, because it is so specific. It is not a vague, ancient people were wise. It is a date, a named meteor stream, and a climate disaster in the geological record that all seem to line up. When the pieces click together like that, it stops feeling like a guess and starts feeling like a code somebody finally cracked. So here is where it sits, and the honest note comes, as it so often does, from the people who actually dig the hill. Two of the lead archaeologists, Jens Notroff and Oliver Dietrich, published a direct reply to the Comet paper, with the rather pointed title, "More Than a Vulture." Their objections were every bit as specific as the claim. The carvings at Göbekli Tepe, they pointed out, were not made in a single moment. They are spread across many pillars in many buildings, cut and recut over centuries. So reading one pillar as a snapshot of one night's sky ignores how the whole place actually grew. The match between animals and constellations isn't fixed either. If you are free to choose which creatures count as stars and which patch of sky to lay them against, you can find very nearly any date you go looking for. And the famous disk carries no label telling us it is a comet. It could be the sun or the moon or one of the round objects that turn up elsewhere on the site, or something we simply have no word for. So it is not the accepted explanation. But, and this is exactly why it earns its airtime tonight, it is not a foolish idea either. And it is a wonderful thing to lie here in the dark and weigh for yourself whether or not Pillar 43 really is a calendar of catastrophe. The fact that we can stand in front of it 11,000 years later and argue the point in earnest is its own kind of marvel. The third theory is older as an idea than Göbekli Tepe is as a discovery, and its most famous living champion is the British writer Graham Hancock, who has argued it across a shelf of best-selling books and, more recently, in front of very large television audiences. Here is the case at full strength, because it deserves a fair hearing. During the last ice age, with so much of the world's water locked up in glaciers, the seas stood hundreds of feet lower than they do now, and vast stretches of coastline that today lie underwater were dry, fertile, livable land. Hancock proposes that somewhere out on those drowned coasts, a genuinely advanced culture grew up. Not spaceships and skyscrapers, but seafarers and astronomers and master builders, generations ahead of the scattered hunter-gatherers around them. Then, at the end of the Ice Age, in that same younger Dryas window of catastrophe, the world turned over. Rapid melting, seas climbing fast, great floods, perhaps comet strikes, drowning that culture's coastal heartland and scrubbing away almost every trace of it. The survivors, he argues, scattered inland and across the world, carrying what they knew, the building, the sky watching, the first seeds of farming, and they handed it to the simpler peoples they washed up among. And this is the point where Göbekli Tepe walks on stage. To Hancock, a site this sophisticated, this early, built by people the textbooks file under simple foragers, does not look like a beginning at all. It looks like an inheritance. The hunter-gatherers, in his telling, did not dream this up out of nothing. They were taught by the refugees of a lost world, and Göbekli Tepe is one of the first places that older knowledge breaks back up through the surface. He points to the planning, the precision, the astronomy people read into the carvings, and he asks the question that does a lot of work for him. Where is the apprenticeship? Where are the clumsy early tries, the failed first drafts? Why does this appear so suddenly and so accomplished? It is, as a story, genuinely gripping, and it pulls on a very old human ache, the dream of a golden age lost under the water, that we have spent the rest of history half remembering. And then you climb down into the dig and you look hard at what is actually in the ground. Flint blades, grinding stones, the butchered bones of wild gazelle and boar and aurochs, charcoal from old cooking fires, stone tools by the thousand, caught at every stage of being made. What you do not find is one single trace of the advanced teachers. No metal, no writing, no machinery, no fine goods carried in from a drowned homeland, nothing a local community with stone tools and a great deal of skill could not have made for themselves. And that missing apprenticeship Hancock asks about turns out to be there after all. It is just spread across the whole region, in the plainer, older sites and the everyday tools nearby that show people working their way up to this, step by patient step, exactly the way you would expect if they figured it out for themselves. So it is a captivating idea on very thin ground, worth turning over as you drift off tonight, but the stones keep insisting, chip by chip, that they were made by local hands, learning as they went. And the fourth theory is, by a wide margin, the most famous of all four, the one nearly everyone listening has heard some version of. It is the idea that Göbekli Tepe was raised with help from somewhere beyond the earth, ancient aliens. The theory has a proper name, the ancient astronaut hypothesis, and a founding father, a Swiss author named Erich von Däniken, whose book Chariots of the Gods sold in the tens of millions and planted one sticky idea in the popular mind. The idea is this: that the great wonders of the ancient world were simply too advanced for the people who supposedly built them. So those people must have had help from visitors who came down out of the sky. Göbekli Tepe, surfacing so old and so accomplished, became a natural new exhibit for that argument, and it has been a fixture of the late-night television version of history ever since. Let's give it its strongest form, because the question underneath it really is a fair one. Look at what the place demanded. Pillars weighing many tons, cut from solid rock, carved with fine detail, lifted and lined up with real care by people with no metal, no wheel, no draft animals, and no writing to carry the plans from one mind to the next. How, the proponents ask, could Stone Age hunter-gatherers possibly have managed engineering on that scale? The precision looks too good, the scale too large, the date far too early. Something this far ahead of its time, they argue, needs an outside hand. And then they point straight at the stones themselves. Those tall, central pillars, the ones with the long-fingered hands and the carved belts, are not ancestors or guardians at all, the proponents say. They are portraits of the visitors, towering, faceless beings set down in stone by the awestruck people they came to. The animals become the visitors' emblems. The whole ring becomes a monument to contact. And the early date, to them, is the clincher, the supposed smoking gun. How else, they ask, could people fresh out of the Ice Age read the heavens or move stone like this, unless someone from elsewhere had shown them how? Here is where it lands, and it is the same ground the lost civilization story came to rest on. Every single object ever lifted out of that hill is human and earthly. Every chip of worked flint, every animal bone, every tool, every mark on every pillar is exactly what you would expect from human hands. Stone tools, rope, earth ramps, and an enormous amount of patient time. There is no scrap of alien metal, no cut that human tools could not make, no material from off the planet, nothing at all that needs a visitor to explain it. And the famous impossibility is not really one. We know it can be done without metal because it was done, and the plainer, older sites scattered across the same region show, step by step, people building up the skill to do it. The honest answer to how could Stone Age people possibly have managed this turns out to be the least mysterious answer in the world. They were a great deal cleverer and a great deal more capable than we have ever given them credit for. And there is something a little sad in handing the achievement to the stars, because the moment you do, you take the single most astonishing thing human beings ever pulled off this early, and you hand the credit to somebody else. The truth is the better story. People did this. People who had not yet invented the wheel did this with their own hands by working together on a cold hill at the edge of the world. I would much rather lie here amazed by them than by anybody from another planet. So what became of it? After all of that, the quarrying, the carving, the hauling, the feasting, the rings of Göbekli Tepe were filled in, packed with rubble and earth and old bones, until the giant stone people were buried up to their shoulders once more, and the hill closed over the top of them. And the reason why is, you will not be surprised to hear by now, argued over. For a long time, the answer was that they did it on purpose, a deliberate burial, a careful covering over, for reasons of their own. Newer work suggests it may be messier than that. Slopes washing down, walls collapsing, buildings repaired and half buried and built over again across a long, slow life, until the earth finally took the whole thing. Not one dramatic ending, but a long biography that simply wound down. And here is the part that turns it from a sad story into a strange and wonderful one. That burial is the only reason you get to hear about this place at all. A ring of carved stone left standing out in the open weathers, down to nothing in a few thousand years. Rain and frost and wind blur the foxes, blunt the vultures, topple the pillars, but buried it kept. Sealed under that pot-bellied hill, the carvings stayed as crisp as the day they were cut, the snakes still pouring, the vulture's wing still raised, waiting in the dark for 11,500 years, until a man who had read an old survey note came up the slope to look twice. And it turns out it was never alone up there, either. Just a few miles off sits another site, Göbekli Tepe, with carved pillars of its own and stranger carvings still being uncovered. And beyond that, a whole scattering of related sites across that corner of Turkey, which the people who study them have started calling the thatched, the stone hills. Göbekli Tepe was not one miracle dropped onto an empty plain. It was the most famous building in a whole world of building, a wide community of people spread across a wide stretch of country, all reaching toward the same idea, with stone, at the same astonishing moment in the human story. Whatever moved them to do it, it moved a lot of them, across a lot of hills, for a very long time. There is a roof over it now, a wide modern shelter, a walkway that carries visitors out above the rings, a museum down the road in the city of Şanlıurfa, and a place on the official list of the most important sites in the world. You could go. It is a real spot, on a real map, open to anyone who makes the trip. The foxes are still there on the stone. The vulture is still there, wing still raised. And 11,500 years after a few hundred hunter-gatherers cut those figures out of the hill, you can stand at the railing, look one of those tall stone people in its blank, patient, faceless top, know almost nothing about why it was made, and feel anyway that somehow you recognize it. So let that be the last picture tonight. The rings of standing stones under their shelter, and in the middle of each circle, the two tall figures facing each other, the carved hand reaching toward the carved hand across the gap, long fingers nearly touching, the way they have nearly touched since before there were farms, or cities, or writing, or wheels. The people who made them are gone. Their names, their language, their gods, the meaning of every fox and snake and vulture, all of it has slipped too far back for us to follow. But the work is still here. The hands are gone. The thing the hands made remains, close enough to touch, too old to read. That is where we will leave it for tonight. The lights are low, the blanket is warm, your feet are tucked in. There is nothing left to do now but breathe slow and let yourself drift, while up on a pale ridge, 11,500 years ago, a few hundred people you will never meet finish raising a ring of stone, and the earth begins to close over it for the long, long wait until somebody comes back up the hill to find it again. Sleep well. We'll be right here tomorrow night with another one. Because it is a little before dawn in Williamsburg, the street outside your window is still dark, and somebody, somewhere close by, has already lit the first fire of the day. It's the hour just before dawn. The sky has gone from black to a dull grey, and the street in front of you is still half dark. The cold air is sharp, and you can see your own breath in front of you. You're standing at one end of a single wide dirt street, and the first thing you notice, before you see a single person or hear a single sound, is how straight it runs. Most old towns grew up by accident. The roads followed cow paths and creek beds and the easiest way around a hill. People built their houses wherever they happened to own a patch of land, and nothing really ever lined up properly. Not this street, though. This one runs dead straight from one end to the other. It might as well have been drawn with a ruler, cutting across the land instead of bending around it. And at each end stands a large building, set there on purpose, and you can tell with just a glance it's meant to matter. This town did not grow by accident. It was designed. Someone laid out a capital city on paper first, and then built it to the plan. The long, straight axis, a seat of government anchoring one end, a college anchoring the other, the governor's house on its own grand approach. Everything about the shape of it is meant to say the same thing. This is a place built to govern, a town that takes itself seriously. The colony's old capital sat downriver at Jamestown, on low, swampy ground, in a fort with a real talent for catching fire. And after the State House, they're burned down yet again. The leaders of Virginia finally decided that running a colony from the inside of a regularly burning bonfire was a poor long-term plan. So they moved inland to higher, drier ground halfway between two rivers. Not wanting to strain themselves with too much creativity, they decided to name the place after the king who was wearing the crown at the time, King William. And so Williamsburg was born. None of that history is visible at this hour. What you can see is smoke. Thin grey threads of it rising from one chimney after another down the length of the street. Because in every house, the first job of the morning, before anyone can cook or wash or get warm, is getting a fire lit. Somewhere close by, an oven is being fed, and a moment later the smell reaches you. Wood smoke first, and then, underneath it, the warm, yeasty smell of bread starting to bake. The people moving around you before the sun rises are not the people who own these handsome houses. A figure crosses a yard with two heavy buckets of water hung from a yoke across his shoulders. Another bends over a hearth, coaxing last night's embers back into flame. The owners of these houses are still asleep in their beds. The town is awake before them because other people are already up holding it together, many of them enslaved, carrying water and wood and fire in the dark so the morning will be warm for someone else. For now, just stand here a moment in the cold, breathe in the smell of the bread, and watch the street come into view as the first light of the day starts to shine. Once the sun comes up, the whole town changes gear, and it happens fast. The street that was empty an hour ago is suddenly full. Not city full, but the particular fullness of a small place with far too much going on at once. The courts are sitting. The colony's assembly is meeting, and that pulls every lawyer, merchant, and man with a grievance in a 100-mile radius up onto their horse and into town. It's why, when you went looking for a bed last night, there wasn't one to be found. There are people sleeping 3 to a rented room tonight, and glad of it. So you step out, and the street comes at you through every sense at once. You notice the gentlemen first, because they have arranged to be seen first. Coats in deep blue and bottle green, hair powdered white, walking with the particular slowness of men who want you to know they are not in a hurry. And a step behind every one of them, the rest of the town. A blacksmith's boy with soot already on his hands, a woman in a plain cap with a basket on her hip, a lawyer half-trotting with papers under his arm, a traveller still grey with road dust, 2 students arguing about something in bad Latin. You hear hooves on packed dirt, the constant background of it, and the wheels of carts. You hear a church bell marking the hour, and somewhere a man shouting a price. A cart rolls by close enough that you step back against a fence to let it pass, and the wheel flicks a little mud onto your shoes. Nobody apologizes. You just have to get used to that kind of thing around here. And then you smell something that is left out of all the historical paintings. This is a town of horses, and horses do not tidy up after themselves, so the street underfoot is part mud, part manure, and by the time the day warms up, it is alive with flies, wood smoke, sweat, tobacco, leather, bread again. It was never the clean, tidy place the paintings show. It is muddy, loud, and working. And threaded all through it, so ordinary that the gentlemen barely glance up, are enslaved men and women moving fast, carrying packages, leading horses, running the errands that make everyone else's morning possible, hurrying not because they're late, but because their time belongs to someone else. You notice them. The town is built so that most people here have trained themselves not to. Let the crowd carry you a little way down the street and follow the loudest sound you can find. It's a hard, bright, ringing sound, steady as a heartbeat with a hammer in it, and it leads you to an open door breathing heat into the cold morning. You stop in the doorway, and the heat rolls straight over your face. It's a bit of a shock after the cold of the street. This is the blacksmith's, and stepping inside is like stepping into a different season. The air is orange. A boy leans on the great bellows, and each push makes the coals flare from red to a furious yellow-white. The smith pulls a bar of iron out of the forge and lays it on an anvil, then begins to shape it with blows so meticulous it sounds like the world's loudest clock. Then he drops it into a barrel of water, and the whole shop hisses and throws up a cloud of steam. Just like that, the first horseshoe of the day has been made. Almost everything the town runs on is made in this room. Hinges, nails, the iron rims of every cartwheel out on the street, tools to make the other tools. It is not glamorous work, but it is some of the most important work in Virginia, a trade-off you'll see again and again here. A few doors down, the sound gets smaller and more careful, and you find the gunsmith. This is patient work, filing, fitting, a length of walnut slowly carved down into the stock of a musket, a lock mechanism no bigger than your palm built from a dozen tiny springs and screws. It smells of oil and metal shavings. It looks like the calmest room on the street. Keep that picture in your mind, because in a year or two, in a town arguing this loudly about who is allowed to own guns and powder, the calmest room on the street is going to matter a great deal. And then, for contrast, the silversmith, where the hammering shrinks to the smallest, most careful tapping you've heard all morning. A man bends over a set of tiny scales, weighing metal worth more than most people in this town will see in a year, turning it into buckles and spoons and presentation cups for people who already own buckles and spoons and cups. Bright work for bright lives. You can see your own face in it, warped and golden if you lean in close enough. Now follow your nose instead of your ears, because the next shop smells of something sharp and oily and faintly metallic. Ink. This is the printing office, and although it's just a room full of paper and lead type, it may be the most dangerous room in town. Not because of anything in it, but because of what comes out of it. A man stands at a tall case of type, plucking individual letters out of little wooden boxes and setting them backward into a frame, reading right to left as easily as you read left to right. Another inks the type with 2 leather pads, lays a damp sheet of paper over it, and hauls down on a great wooden screw. The press gives a long, groaning creak, then lifts the paper away with a whole page of the colony's newspaper printed on it, still wet. Finished sheets hang drying overhead like laundry. And that newspaper, the Virginia Gazette, is where this colony argues with itself. The shipping news, the prices, the furious, unsigned essays about Parliament and taxes and rights. And the same page that carries those grand words about liberty also carries something else, set in the very same plain font. A few columns over is a notice offering a slave for sale, and another offering a reward for the return of a man who freed himself by running. As you read the drying sheet of newspaper, the press groans again. The work goes on, the way it always does. Out the door and across into something easier on the eyes. The milliner's shop is all color. Bolts of silk, ribbons in a dozen shades, pins, fine thread, and a half-sewn gown lies on a table while 2 women debate exactly how far the sleeve should be cut to be fashionable this season. Half of what's in here came from overseas. The other half is local work from seamstresses who can take cheap materials and a small budget and turn out something that looks like it sailed in from London. And next to that, the wig maker, where the air goes powdery and sweet with pomade, and a gentleman sits very still under a cloud of white hair powder, while his head is shaved smooth and a curled wig is fitted in its place. It is pure vanity, and everyone in the room knows it, and the gentleman is willing to go into debt for it, which is a telling truth about this town. Appearances here aren't just a luxury. They're how you tell everyone exactly where you stand. And in this town, where you stand is everything. Now we'll walk all the way to the eastern end of the street, to the big, handsome brick building that has been waiting for you since dawn. This is the Capitol. From the outside, it's just a fine building. Inside, it holds the most important room in the colony. Inside, it's cooler, and the noise of the street drops away to the sound of your own footsteps on a wood floor. You're not alone in here. A doorkeeper nods you through. Men in proper coats stand in twos and threes along the walls, talking low. Burgesses, in from their home counties for the session. A clerk crosses the floor with a ledger and a travelling ink pot. A lawyer goes past with a leather folio of papers under one arm, and on a bench along the wall, 2 or 3 plainer men sit waiting, hats in their laps, come to put a petition or a case before the court, and prepared to wait all day for the chance. This is where the colony does both its governing and its judging, where the lawmakers, the House of Burgesses, meet to make the rules, and where the colony's highest court hears the cases that matter most. Virginia is one of the largest, richest, and most powerful colonies Britain has, and a great deal of what makes it powerful is decided in these rooms, by men who have started to suspect they might be rather good at governing themselves. Stand in the chamber a moment. The benches are plain, the room is panelled and quieter than you expected, and it smells of wood and ink and the bodies of a lot of men who have been arguing in here since morning. A few years before your visit, a young, not yet famous lawyer stood up in here and gave a speech against a new tax from London. The speech came so close to calling the king a tyrant that older, steadier men told the young lawyer to sit down. Everyone who was there agreed it was electrifying. No one could agree afterward on his exact words, and people argue about them to this day. That young lawyer's name was Patrick Henry, and the argument he started in this room did not end in this room. It ends, eventually, in a war. Now let's step out of the Capitol building, blink in the daylight, and let the town feed us for a while, because by now the market has hit its stride. There are stalls and barrows and shop fronts spilling their goods toward the street. Baskets of vegetables still cool from a garden. Fish, cloth, buttons, nails, cheese and butter. A pen of complaining livestock. A peddler swearing his ribbons are the finest in the colony to a woman who has clearly heard that exact promise from him before. It's bustling and loud, and it is, quite frankly, a pleasure to wander through with nothing you actually have to buy. Somewhere nearby, a stall is frying something in fat, and the smell of it crosses the whole square and reaches you before you've decided anything. Your stomach answers it first. Watch the money, though, or rather, watch how little of it there is. Almost no one is paying with coins. A planter points at what he wants, and it's simply written down, added to his account, set against the tobacco he'll ship in the autumn, weighed one day against a bill from a merchant in London or Glasgow. This whole prosperous, bustling town runs not on coins in pockets, but on promises written in ledgers, on trust and tobacco and debt that reaches all the way across the Atlantic. Many people in the 1770s were in debt. Some things never change. And then there's what you can actually buy. Tea from one side of the world, sugar from another, wine, fine wool, books, a clock. The produce of half the planet, somehow arriving on one street in one small Virginia town. Because tobacco grown in the fields out past the houses is valuable enough to pull the whole world toward it. A whole town living handsomely on money it doesn't have yet, and everyone betting on a good tobacco harvest this coming autumn, the way, so far, it always has. By now you're probably hungry, And the good news is that this town has never met a problem that couldn't be improved by a trip to the local tavern. You push through the doors of the largest one in town, the Raleigh, and the warmth and the noise close in on you like water. Somebody pushes a tankard into your hand almost before you've found anywhere to sit, and you squeeze onto the end of a bench between a man who is asleep sitting upright and a man who is losing badly at cards and taking it personally. This single building is, all at once, a restaurant, a hotel, a bar, a games room, a stable, and an unofficial parliament. There are men eating, men arguing, and men who have clearly been here since breakfast. The smell is extraordinary. Roasting and stewing meat, fresh bread, pipe smoke, spilled wine, and the warm heaviness of a room full of people enjoying themselves indoors. The food comes heavy and generous for those who can pay for it. Stews, meat pies, fish brought up from the rivers, bread, and to drink, wine and Madeira and rum, or tea and coffee for the more respectable hours. There is a game of cards happening in one corner, the click of billiard balls in another, dice somewhere you can hear but not see. When night falls, the lucky travelers will sleep in real beds upstairs, and the unlucky ones will sleep on the floor of the same rooms, and both will pay for the privilege. But the most important thing about this tavern is a single upstairs room, the Apollo Room. When the royal governor got tired of the lawmakers in that grand capital arguing with him, he did what royal governors did. He dissolved them, sent them home, locked them out of their own chamber. And the lawmakers, refusing to simply stop, walked straight down the street to this tavern, climbed the stairs to this room, and went right on meeting, agreeing over wine to stop buying British goods altogether. The revolution does not only get planned in marble halls, a good deal of it gets planned in the local tavern. But none of that is your problem, though. The only problem you have, thankfully, is deciding whether to have the meat pie or the stew. It's now the afternoon, so let us leave the tavern and go tour a few grander locations. First, north off the main street, down its own straight approach, the Governor's Palace. The gravel of the approach has been raked into lines so straight that walking up it feels faintly like trespassing, and your footsteps are the loudest thing for 100 yards. Everything about this place is built to make you feel slightly smaller. The gates, the perfect symmetry, the gleam of imported everything, and behind the palace are gardens clipped into careful geometric shapes that nature could never produce on its own. Order imposed on living things to make a point, and the point is power. This is the King's Man in Virginia, living like it. And by the time of your visit, there is the faintest crack running under all that polish, because the man who lives here and the men who run the colony are starting to genuinely frighten each other. The gardens are immaculate. The weeding and clipping and hauling that keeps them that way falls to enslaved gardeners, whose work is the reason order looks effortless. Back toward the street's far western end stands the college, William and Mary, one of the oldest in all the colonies, second only to Harvard. It is full of young men with too many books, too much Latin, ambitious fathers, and impressive debts. One of them, a tall red-headed student with an enormous appetite for reading, studied here not long before your visit, and then stayed in town to read law under a brilliant local lawyer named George Wythe. The student's name was Thomas Jefferson. He is, at this point, simply another clever young man in a town full of them. No one here has any idea yet what they've got. And then, newest of all, out on the edge of town, is a plain and serious building that's the first of its kind anywhere in British North America. A public hospital built to care for people suffering from illnesses of the mind. It has only just opened. The age does not understand these illnesses, and much of what happens inside would horrify us now. But hold on to what it represents. A colony deciding, for the first time, that the care of its most troubled people was a public responsibility and not simply a family's private grief. It is new, it is frightening, and it is, in its strange way, a town trying. By evening, the working day eases off, and a town this full of visitors is not about to waste a good night. This little capital takes its fun seriously. It has one of the very first proper theatres in British America, and when a company is in town, the place fills with people who have dressed for the occasion and intend to be seen having opinions about the performance. There are balls and assemblies where the gentry dance for hours by candlelight, and they take the dancing genuinely seriously, with dancing masters making a real living teaching Virginia how to point its feet correctly. There is music coming out of doorways, the saw and lift of a fiddle finding its tune. You hadn't come to dance yourself, of course, but the sets are forming, the room is a couple short, and a dancing master with a small fiddle and no patience for shyness takes you by the hand and puts you in the line. The steps are easier than they look, mostly walking, with better posture and more confidence than you actually feel. The person across from you clearly knows the steps better than you do, but is kind enough not to say so. The candles. The fiddle lifts. You hold eye contact a moment longer than the dance strictly calls for, before the music turns the two of you away down the set to the next person. You didn't catch their name, and we won't be here much longer, so you probably missed your chance. Now, we move on to the races. A few times a year the town throws a fair, and on fair days there are horse races just outside, and people bet on them with an enthusiasm that suggests the colonists may not have fully thought through their own sermons about restraint. A good horse is a celebrity here. A fast one can make a poor man briefly rich and a rich man briefly furious, and the whole town turns out along the rail to shout at animals that cannot understand them. Just stand in the middle of it for a moment. Fiddle music in the warm dark, the smell of roasting food from a fair stall, somebody laughing too loud, the thunder of hooves and a roar going up from the rail. For one evening, the arguments and the ledgers and the speeches are set down, and this small, serious town simply enjoys itself. But the light is going now, and as it goes, the mood of the town shifts. The thing that has been sitting underneath the whole bright day starts to show. You feel it first in the taverns, in the way certain conversations drop in volume when a stranger passes. There is a building near the edge of town with thick brick walls, the magazine. And inside it is the colony's gunpowder, the stores a militia would need if it ever came to a fight. And one night, not far from the time of your visit, the royal governor sends men to secretly take that powder away, out of the town, onto a ship. When morning comes and people realize the powder is gone, the town nearly comes apart, because everyone understands what it means. A government does not take away your powder unless it is starting to think of you as the enemy. Whatever trust was left between Virginia and its king does not survive it. From here, the road runs one direction only, toward the day, a little later, when the men meeting in this very town will instruct their delegates to go to Congress and propose the unthinkable, that these colonies become free and independent states and cut themselves loose from the crown entirely. And here is the hard center of the place. This town is about to risk everything for liberty, and they do not intend to bluff. At the same time, half the people in the town are owned. When the governor, desperate, offers freedom to any enslaved person who will leave a rebel master and fight for the king, thousands of them hear it for exactly what it is, a door. The men in the taverns call it a cruelty and a trick. The people in the kitchens call it a chance. Both are right in a sense. And now, the day is winding down. The last guests leave the taverns, a little unsteady, off to their crowded rented beds. The fiddle stops. The theatre goes dark. Out on the long straight street, the shop fronts are shuttered, and the only light left is the swing of a lantern here and there, and the deep orange of banked fires through the windows. A horse shifts its weight in a stable and settles. A door latch drops somewhere down the row. The insects of a Virginia night come up out of the warm dark. In the kitchens and the backyards, a few fires are still tended by the same people who lit the first ones this morning, banking the coals so they'll catch again before dawn. The town can rest because, for a little while longer, someone is still seeing to it. And what a town it is tonight. You stood at the end of an empty street before dawn and watched it fill with a whole colony's worth of people, lawyers and silversmiths and students and racehorses, ink and silk and silver and gunpowder, a newspaper that could topple a governor and a tavern where a revolution gets argued over dinner plates. This is the largest, richest colony in America, gathered onto one straight mile at the very height of its noise and its brilliance and its nerve. It does not know that within a few years the government will pack up for Richmond. This street will empty out, and this loud, important place will shrink back into a small one again. Tonight, none of that has happened yet. Tonight, it is still the center of everything. You've walked the entirety of it now, from the first thread of smoke before dawn to the last door closing after dark. You've seen what this one small street really held. All of it, at once, on a single, ordinary day. The fires are banked. The street is dark and straight and empty. There is nothing left for you to carry, and nowhere you need to be. So let the town go dark around you. Let the lantern light blur. Let your breathing slow to the long rhythm of a sleeping town. And rest.